The snowstorm had been merciless that night, howling through the mountain pass like a wounded beast. Ilara Ven stood at her cottage door, watching the white fury consume the world beyond her small sanctuary. She had lived alone in these mountains for 5 years now, ever since the war had taken everything from her: her family, her village, her faith in the empire that claimed to protect humanity. She was about to close the door when she saw them. 2 massive shapes lay collapsed in the snow, barely visible through the blizzard. At first she thought they were boulders, but then she saw the glint of scales, the curve of ancient horns, the faint rise and fall of labored breathing. Dragons. Old ones. By the look of their weathered hides and the frost that had crystallized along their spines, any sane person would have left them. Dragons were the enemy, had been for 3 centuries. The Empire's propaganda was clear. Dragons were monsters, devourers of cities, killers of innocents. But Ilara had stopped believing in the Empire's truths long ago. She trudged through knee-deep snow and reached the first dragon. His scales were deep bronze, dimmed by age and cold. His eyes, ancient, golden, and fading, cracked open to meet hers. "Let me. Be in peace." "Human," the dragon rasped, his voice like grinding stone. "Not tonight," Ilara said firmly. "I didn't survive 5 winters alone to watch anyone freeze on my doorstep." It took her 3 hours. 3 hours of digging, pulling, and using every scrap of rope and leverage she could muster. She was only human, fragile, weak by the standards of the galaxy's greater species, but she was also stubborn. She dragged the first dragon, Sarthos as he had whispered his name, into her barn. Then she went back for the second, a smaller dragon with silver-blue scales who hadn't even the strength to speak. She built fires. She melted snow for water. She fed them what little dried meat and herbs she had. The dragons were too weak to protest, too cold to refuse. As dawn approached, Sarthos fixed her with those golden eyes. "Why?" he asked. "We are your kind's ancient enemy." Ilara met his gaze without flinching. "Because you're cold and dying, and I have a fire and walls." "That's reason enough." Sarthos said nothing more. But something shifted in his expression, something like wonder. Morning came with a sound that shattered the fragile peace. The march of boots, the clank of armor, the barked commands of soldiers. Ilara stepped outside to find her cottage surrounded. 200 Imperial soldiers stood in formation, their weapons gleaming in the pale sunlight. At their head was Commander Torvin, a man whose cruelty was legendary even among the Empire's ranks. "Ilara Ven," he called out, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "We have received reports of dragon activity in this region. You will surrender any creatures you are harboring immediately." Ilara's jaw tightened. "There are no creatures here, Commander. Only guests." Torvin's smile was thin and dangerous. "Dragons are not guests, woman. They are abominations. Surrender them, or we will burn this hovel to the ground with you inside it." Before Ilara could respond, the barn doors exploded outward. Sarthos emerged first, his bronze scales now gleaming with renewed fire, his eyes blazing with ancient fury. Behind him came the silver-blue dragon, smaller but no less fierce. They were still weak, still injured, but they stood between Ilara and the soldiers like living fortresses. "You dare threaten the one who showed us mercy?" Sarthos's voice boomed across the snow, shaking the very mountains. "You dare raise weapons against the woman who embodied the virtue your empire claims to champion?" Commander Torvin paled but held his ground. "Dragons cannot be trusted." "We are what your kind made us," Sarthos interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. "For 300 years we have fought because your empire hunted us to near extinction. But this one human, this fragile, mortal woman, reminded us what we had forgotten." He turned his great head toward Ilara. "She reminded us that mercy still exists." The silver-blue dragon spoke for the first time, her voice like wind through crystal. "We came here to die, to end our suffering in the cold. Instead, she gave us warmth. She gave us life. And you would repay her kindness with violence?" The soldiers shifted uneasily. Some lowered their weapons. Others looked to their commander for guidance. Torvin's face twisted with rage. "This is treason." "She harbored the enemy." "She harbored the dying," Sarthos corrected. "And that is the difference between her and you, human. She saw life where you see only war." Ilara stepped forward, placing herself between the dragons and the soldiers. Her voice was calm, but it carried across the clearing with unexpected strength. "I am just one woman. I have no army, no power, no title. But I know this. If your empire has become so twisted that showing mercy is treason, then perhaps the empire is the true enemy. Silence fell. The soldiers looked at each other, uncertainty rippling through their ranks. They had come expecting a simple arrest, perhaps a quick execution. They had not expected to face dragons who spoke of mercy, or a woman who stood unarmed before 200 soldiers without flinching. Commander Torvin raised his sword. Fire on my command, Commander. One of the soldiers stepped forward, lowering his weapon. Then another. Then 10 more. Within moments, half the company had laid down their arms. We did not join the Empire to murder civilians who show compassion, the first soldier said quietly. Torvin's face went crimson with fury, but he was not a fool. Outnumbered by his own men's conscience, he had no choice but to retreat. This isn't over, he snarled at Alara. The Emperor will hear of this. Good, Alara replied. Let him hear that humanity is not defined by our weapons, but by our choices. As the soldiers withdrew, Sarthos lowered his great head toward Alara. You have made powerful enemies today, small one. Alara smiled wearily. I've had powerful enemies before. I'm still here. The silver-blue dragon rumbled with what might have been laughter. Humans, she said with bemused respect. So small, so brief, yet sometimes so impossibly brave. Sarthos nodded slowly. The galaxy has misunderstood your kind. We all have. You are not strong because of your weapons or your empires. You are strong because even in your darkest hours, some of you still choose kindness. Alara looked up at the 2 ancient dragons, then back at her small cottage. I just didn't want anyone to freeze, she said simply. But in that simplicity lay the truth that would echo across the stars. That humanity's greatest strength was not in its capacity for war, but in its refusal to let compassion die, even in the coldest, darkest nights. And sometimes that was enough to change everything.